Hi, I'm Eddie Patton, neurologist in Houston, Texas, and president-elect of the Texas Neurological Society. I'm also a current member of the Board on Medical Economics. I'm excited today to bring to you this edition of The Business of Neurology. The Business of Neurology is a video series that's sponsored by the Texas Neurological Society. The goal of this series is to help members of the Texas Neurological Society understand more business aspects of the practice of medicine and neurology. Are you considering selling your practice? Are you interested in the recent buzz about private equity firms and investment firms buying and consolidating physician practices? Well, today we're going to talk with industry expert John Finley on these topics and more. A little more information about John. John has worked in several industries in Houston, including financial services, medical sales, medical consulting, publishing, advertising, marketing, mergers, and acquisitions. He has acquired and developed several practices over the years. He has over 25 years of experience in acquiring and growing physician practices. Since 1993, he's been with the Texas Medical Consulting firm. He was integral in the formation of PRG, Physician Resource Group, which is an ophthalmology PPM, which at its peak had over 100 physicians in over 30 states. Over the course of his career, he has overseen over $125 million of merger and acquisition activity. So let's head over and talk to John. All right, so we're here with John to talk more about how and when to sell your practice. John, thank you so much for being here
Thanks
today.
for having me, Dr. Patton. I appreciate it.
Excellent, excellent. So let's start right off and get into it. Tell me a little bit about the demographics of the neurologists or the physicians that are looking to sell their practice. What's the typical age, size of the group, and so forth?
Interestingly, unless there's a health issue, most physicians are practicing longer. There's a lot of baby boomers, right? And so that's what, 60 plus. But I would think that if I was at the top of my profession, like most of these physicians are, why would you look to leave at 70? No reason. So what we're seeing demographically is an older group, unless there's been a health issue. And I'm going to tell you, I've gotten half a dozen calls in the last 2 months on health issues. Mm-hmm. So just a brief on that. As soon as something bad happens, call us. Mm-hmm. Because the longer you wait with the practice, patients expect to be seen. Yeah. And the longer you wait, the more it dwindles and the less your asset is worth, because your practice is definitely an asset. As far as nationally, in 1990, Richard Scrushy founded Med Partners. I don't know if you remember that. Mm-hmm. And that grew in 10 years to $1 billion company. In the 90s there were the specialty companies. I worked with two, an ophthalmology and an orthopedic specialty company. That's really not the things that are happening now. Most of the emphasis now has been on either geriatric, which in their definition, that's 55 and up, especially concentrated on Medicare and Medicare Advantage patients. That's an entire group that's doing that. And then there's others that look for GP, internal medicine, because they feel like they control the dollars. There's multiple groups. There's multiple groups nationally, most of them funded by venture capital, but others not, that have their specific way of doing things, and none of them are the same. There's actually even a group in Houston that purchases practices. They're expanding out of Houston now, but they started here.
Excellent. So that brings us to the next question of, tell me a little bit more about the different models then. You just alluded to it. What are the different models of acquisition, or who can I sell my practice to as a physician?
Great question. And it runs all over the field. The first one used to be recruit a younger guy, sell him your practice as you retire. That's harder and harder, especially in smaller groups like neurology or dermatology or things like that. The numbers aren't there. There's not the big pool of graduates that you can find and recruit. Almost everybody now also is trying to join a group practice because it's just so much easier to qualify for all the contracts that you have to. Insurers really are loath to give an individual doctor all the contracts, and when they do, they're much less terms. So there's that part. One group that's very interesting, they're out of Florida. They only want to buy Medicare Advantage patients, which is interesting because I deal with a lot of GPs that have large panels. And the panel is like this. So let's say I'm Aetna. I attribute a certain number of patients to you for a Medicare Advantage. It might be 100, it might be 1,000. But most practices don't make as much money on Medicare Advantage patients. So interestingly, some of the practices have tried to limit their Medicare Advantage, whereas if you were going to align yourself with this company, you'd want as many as you could possibly get. But they have a different model totally than most of the others, and they pay better. Their model is based on a full risk contract with the insurers. I'll just give you some examples. A lot of contracts with GPs pay like $30, $40, $50 per member per month. And then they see them, they don't see them, you know, it's whatever happens. And you have to have several hundred of them for that to even make an impact on your practice. This company doesn't do it that way. They have a full risk contract, and it starts around $1,000 per member per month. Now, the MRA number which they assign to each patient based on their health or lack of health can go down to 800 up to 1,400. But when they take over a practice, it's multi-millions. It could even be $1 million a month in revenue to them. There's no GPs that we know that are doing $1 million a month.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting model, and they claim theirs is data-driven, that they have a very, very specific set of criteria. They have multiple community outreach people, so that they're talking to their patients and keeping them out of the hospital, which is where the big bills ring up. So that's them. But they only want the Medicare Advantage. So if you've got a practice that you've built over 40 years, you got 5,000 patients, only about 20 or 30% of them are going to be seniors unless you're older. If you're older and you've been practicing for 40 years, okay, maybe your patients all aged with you. But if not, then at least half, if not more than half of your patients are not going to be Medicare age. So what happens to them? Well, there's multiple groups that will buy them here. As you well know from your past experience, hospital groups can make money off of everything that's not the doctor, right? They've got the doctor and the overhead, and that's almost a loss leader for them. But they make everything from diagnostic testing to MRIs, everything, surgery. And so that's why
downstream revenue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for them, that was the biggest piece. And 5, 10 years ago, that's why they went out and bought people right and left. But then they figured out that the operating cost of just willy-nilly buying a practice wasn't there. And so there's been some shift in that. So that's, if you're a neurologist, you can see a certain number of patients, right? And almost all of them come from referral. So it's going to be hard to get any patients actually attributed to you. So in the neurology world, I would think that you'd either have to be joining a group that had a need for a neurologist, not necessarily a neurology group, but a group that could use neurology for their patient group. And then add ancillary services as we discussed. If they can do that, then they can maximize the value, and you can maximize your negotiating position with them. Then there's the different groups like I was talking about here in Houston. They buy your practice in totality. They split it in a couple of different ways because, again, most of the Medicare money, it may or may not be the highest payer, but it's the most consistent payer. And with all the rules and regs that have come out, most of the time if you file electronically, you can get your bill within 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
That's fast, and it's great for cash flow. And Texas actually has a law about prompt payment. Almost everyone's afraid to use it though, because they think, okay, Aetna, hey, you guys hadn't paid me for 45 days. Prompt payment says you have to pay me inside of 30. They're afraid Aetna's going to go, you know what, you're right, here's your money and you're out of our panel. Yeah. And so they're afraid to even use it. So that's kind of interesting. But so those are the three main models, unless I found a lot of guys that because they've been in the business so long, they know a lot of people. And a lot of people's children, grandchildren, uncles, whatever, were doctors, and they became doctors because of it. So they have access to a different pool
Okay.
So if they know somebody and they've got a successful practice and they bring somebody in, that works as well. It's just not as easy to do it that way as it used to be.
So there's no real cookie cutter, one size fits all. You really have to figure out what model best works for what you're looking for.
Absolutely, and the interesting part is geography. As you well know, people that go to medical school typically practice within 40 miles of where they went to medical school. That's why Houston has such a humongous, not just population, but a humongous physician population. So, you know, if you're in one of the larger cities, everything's much different. It's easier to get patients, easier to get contracts, and easier to sell your practice to somebody else. If you're in one of the rural areas, it's much more difficult. Now, I don't know if a rural area could support a neurology practice by itself anyway, unless it was a hub.
Yeah.
But that's kind of, unfortunately, the rule of the day is geography.
Geography. So you explained geography, but what are some other reasons why physicians are deciding to sell their practices nowadays?
Well, the number one is, you know, this whole retirement myth. I personally don't believe in retirement, but and if I, like I said, if I was a physician and I was at the top of my game, why would I want to? I would cut back maybe, but I don't know that I'd want to retire. So the number one for the younger guys is health.
Okay.
Number two is usually some type of family situation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be health. I mean, if they've got a wife or something that says, hey, we've got enough money, let's go travel the world, and you know, you're 65, let's go. So that's another one. But really, frustration, I would think, is probably the number one reason. As you know from being in both the system and private practice, it's very difficult to be in a private practice. Yeah. Very difficult, even if you have partners, because the insurance companies are the ones, you know, whoever has the gold rules, they have the gold and they rule. And they can drop you for no reason whatsoever. And it's happened to practices that I've worked with. And it's hard. You've got to scramble hard to get back in with another group of insurance companies, usually joining an IPA group of other physicians to make it worthwhile. Financial and age, I guess, would be the other two. You know, again, there's this huge retirement myth that everybody should retire 65 to 70 and live out their golden years. You can structure your sale to where you can do stuff like that. Okay. I have a semi-retired physician in one of my practices now. He practices 3 half-days a week and takes 2 weeks off every couple months. I don't call it country club medicine, but I mean, his patients are happy that he's still practicing. He's very happy to still be practicing, but at the same time, he takes these trips and goes nationally, internationally, whatever, and his quality of life is huge.
Yeah, and we're hearing so much in medicine, particularly about just that, quality of life and burnout prevention. And so I think it is imperative, particularly in private practice where we're seeing so many problems, that we start working towards figuring out what works for us, you know, and how to create a model like that doctor you were talking about.
No question. And the thing about it is it's getting very difficult, the patient acquisition process. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. So let's say that you're in a Medicare product like an Aetna Medicare Advantage plan. You're assigned to a doctor. Now, that doctor may not be you that I've been seeing for the last 25 years. It may be a doctor over here because they're in a bigger group and the insurance company just was pushing that way. You have to actually fight as a patient to get rid of that and come back to you. That's a very difficult process, and that's what's happening a lot to the smaller practice guys.
Yeah. So now I've decided that I want to sell my practice. I've called you up and said, hey, for one of these variety of reasons, I think I want to look for something else and want to sell my practice. What then happens to me? What are my options? What if I want to continue to practice and so forth? What are the different options for the physicians if they do decide?
Well, mentally, you've got to put a lot of thought into it, because there's everything from stopping the day that you sell the practice to continuing to run the practice even though you sold it, and everything in between. So you've really got to spend a lot of time deciding what you want to do as a physician, how much you want to work, how you want to work, where you want to work. If you join a group, they may have multiple offices and want you to go drive around. May or may not work for you. So you've got to put a lot of thought into your individual circumstance and then decide from there. After you do that, then all those other questions can come into play. Every group has their own, let's say, set of I don't want to call them rules because they're flexible, but ways of operating. So I'll give you an example. The one that I told you out of Florida that bought Medicare Advantage. If you want to join them, they're happy to have you come, but you have to fit into their system. And it only gives you two options. One, shake hands, pat them on the back, say, hey, thanks for coming. This is your new doctor. I'll be around. That's one position for them. The other position is data-driven, where they're basically married to the computer all day long. They have a specific set of parameters that they have to operate on, and a lot of it's data-driven. That's how they claim they're keeping their patients healthier. But that company has a different model in that, as a private practice, you're driven to see as many patients as you can per hour per day. Not them. They see a maximum of 10 to 15 a day. That's it. That's it. And that's only if there's like 4 or 5 emergency type situations. I mean, they basically see 1 an hour.
Okay.
So that's another interesting model.
Yeah.
But there's other ways to go too. You know, you can say, I want to practice half days a week. I want to practice 2 days a week. And you just need to find then who fits for you. And they'll work with you. I mean, if they really want access to your patients, they'll work with you.
And when you are acquiring or these practices bringing together, I have seen where there are models or acquirers who have like the primary care with the neurology. So it's fitting in where you have that patient base that's feeding to you.
No question. I mean, the whole theory of you being able to just hang out your shingle and get patients, not so much. If you don't already have the referral sources in place and you're a new one coming out, it's going to be very difficult. So they look for younger guys, if they want to do private practice, which is dwindling, they look for guys that are well connected. But that's the smaller portion. The bigger portion is other groups. Like, I know a group here in town that has 4 practices. They're actively looking for a neurologist. They think they can fill up a neurologist schedule a couple of days a week and then do the ancillaries with them. Okay. That's an interesting model. Another model would be a large primary care group that needed to add orthopedic, neurology, dermatology, all of the normal things that make the continuum of care work.
All right, John. So now you've convinced me that it's time for me to give up private practice and to sell my practice. But how do I put a number value on my practice to know that I'm getting the most for the years that I've done in business?
That's a great question. All companies, no matter who it is, I mean, even if it's just Joe Blow out of school using a CPA, they're all going to ask the same questions. And the questions are typically somewhat financial and somewhat patient-driven. Okay. So the financial ones, they're going to ask for your last 3 months. How many patients you're seeing, what your revenues are, what your overhead is, very specific things. But you should have that. There's easy ways, there's hard ways. I'm telling you, the easiest way is to look at your practice revenue 2 ways. One, gross, one, net. So you could say that your rule of thumb is at least 1 times gross. So if you were doing 600,000, then you would at least look for 600,000. If you were doing it on a net, let's say you're 50% overhead, same example, 600,000 would be 50% less 300,000. The problem is when someone comes in, if they're not a doctor, they've got to replace you as the doctor. So that 300,000 then becomes 100, 150, and then they're going to attach a multiple to that. So is that multiple going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever? If it's 4, it's the same as 1 time gross. I try to look for the extra revenue that's in there that's not necessarily apparent. As you expressed earlier, the downstream revenue, you can get a piece of that up front if you ask for it. Okay. Because they are definitely going to make it, or why else would they do the deal? Some of them want to see the last 12 months, and especially in your mind, you've had some change that makes a further look back, make your practice look better. Okay. Because some of the models are specific to financial. So let's say, and I'm just making up numbers here, let's say you do $50,000 a month, $600,000 a year. And let's say you're a typical 50% overhead, so that's $300 that goes net to you. They're going to do some kind of a multiplier on the 300. They're going to say, okay, well, that's him, he owns it, we got to pay somebody 150, so we really only have 150 in net earnings. We'll give you a 4 multiple and pay you 600. Well, now you could also say that was 1 times revenue. and come up with the same number.
Gotcha.
So what I try to do is get people between 2 and 3 times their net, or 1 to 2 times their gross. And I make all kinds of cases for it. And every doctor is not, 8 to 6, Monday through Friday, bang, bang all the time. So I can show that there's money left on the table for each one. So that's one way to do it. And again, some of these other practice acquisition companies are doing some different things. The one is going after just Medicare Advantage patients. So if I was going to position there, I would all of a sudden open up my panel and go find another couple hundred patients to attribute.
Yeah.
The other one that's doing a gamut, I would look at where their focus was, and if it was kids, then I'd go get a bunch of kids. Because you can do that. Depending on your zip code, I mean, unless you're in the medical center where every doctor is, you can pretty much pick. Because all the insurance companies do it by zip code. So an easy rule of thumb would be to think you could get one time.
Okay.
Then the interesting question becomes, what happens to the AR? How good are you at collecting? How poor are you at collecting? Let's say you've got a typical 90-day AR. Okay, so that would be $150,000. You can negotiate to get your one time plus the $150,000, or you can get them to buy your AR, but then they're going to want to discount it by whatever collection rate they think is going to work. But there's little things like that using somebody like me can help get you a little bit extra at the end.
And AR, for those who don't know, is accounts receivable.
Accounts receivable, which is the bills that come in.
Absolutely.
I was with a lab today, and they told me they get collections up to a year out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's not running your practice very efficiently sometimes. You can't do that. All right. So, in closing, tell me, what are some of the pros of selling your practice?
Well, the pros are you don't have to worry about the daily management. Most of the guys that talk to me complain continuously about the employee issues. And I don't care if you've got nothing but relatives. That might even be worse. I don't know. There's the interpersonal relationship with all of them, and then they want to gripe to you. That's probably the biggest headache. Then you've got everything from, if you have the age group that has children, what happens if you're running a real lean staff, but one of them's kid gets sick, and now you don't have a receptionist that day? So it's almost always the overhead of running the practice that way. Then there's the financial overhead of just how you do stuff. Everybody's got a different way. Some people really run it tight. They do as much stuff as they can themselves, et cetera. Others farm everything out. And there's some savings in there for some of the acquisition companies.
Excellent. And now, what are some of the cons for selling?
The cons are it's not your practice anymore. And if they have some policy that you don't agree with, guess what? It's their company now. And that's the biggest one, because most of the doctors that I meet are solo guys. Sometimes it's small groups, and small groups are a little more decentralized in their decision making. They're used to negotiating conflict stuff. But a solo guy just makes his own decision, and that's it. And so if I'm real tight with that, and somebody else comes in and makes a decision that I don't agree with, then what happens? And you can actually put that in the contract. Then what happens? What happens then? But that's one of the biggest cons is you're no longer in charge.
Yeah. And that loss of autonomy for a lot of physicians is something that they definitely don't want to lose.
Well, and as you know, no one can tell the doctor what to do as far as practice goes, medical practice goes. They can make all the suggestions they want. And I'm going to tell you that all these companies are making more and more money with the ancillary services, the referrals, that sort of thing. So there's going to be some pressure on the doctor to be able to say, hey, maybe with this group of patients, we need to be saying, you need to go get these tests done. Doctor may or may not agree.
Got it. And that brings me to a final question, because we haven't talked much about one of the biggest frustrations with physicians is the administrative burden. And that's one of the main reasons I hear as well, as far as why they are tired of running their own practice. How can linking up with someone like yourself with so much experience running practice, how can that help with that administrative burden and overhead?
There are actually 2 companies, one based in Dallas, that provide the 100% non-medical services for your practice. They'll hire, they'll fire, they'll train, they'll do the billing and collection, they'll do all that stuff. and they do it for some kind of a flat fee or flat percentage. I could argue both sides of taking that deal. Okay. Most of the time, I've seen smaller revenue practices make that deal because they have less time to be doing those functions and services. But here's the thing. I don't charge for recruiting. Most of my practices need recruiting. I'll show them how to run ads and we can do interviews and this, that, and the other. But if you can hire the right people, you can really reduce that. I mean, and almost always the right person is not your wife. You know, a lot of guys think it's their wife, and it's really not. It's having a professional outside administrator come in, and even if you're only doing some contract stuff, like 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week, those people are out there, and they immeasurably increase the functionality of your practice.
Well, John, this has been great, and I really appreciate your insight into this topic. Any closing thoughts? Anything else you want to tell our viewers about that maybe considering?
Preparation is the deal. You don't want to be forced into a situation where you have to sell. As I've told you, in the last 3 months, I've had 6 people approach me, but it was under bad circumstances. I got cancer, I had a heart attack, doctor died, all this stuff. Then it's kind of too late. Then it's a whatever you can get. Whereas if you have a succession plan in mind, or you have, okay, this is 2022, I want to be retired by 2025. Great, that's the way to go, because then you can plan it out and figure out what to do.
John, thank you again for being here with us today. I learned so much today about this whole emerging field of mergers and acquisitions in medical practice.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you. And thank you again for joining us here for this edition of The Business of Neurology. Stay tuned for future episodes in this video series.